Hey everyone, welcome to another GameDev live stream. I'm your host, I guess, Charles Amat. I'm with Infallible Code, and today I've got Jason Story with me once again. We streamed about a week ago, and we looked at some projects, looked at some of our own code, and so today I think we're going to take that a step further. And I kind of wanted to go over how it is that we set up our projects, generally speaking. So, if you've been following the channel, you have seen videos kind of surrounding this topic. We've got a video on assemblies that we did, a video on namespaces, and I've got a whole bunch of like unit testing videos, and kind of wanted to bring all that together and just talk about the things that we do to just sort of set a nice foundation for the project with our file structure, again setting up assemblies and namespaces, and then just talk to those things, how it helps a project scale, how it helps drive how a project grows as far as structure, and then things like system boundaries and those details that are like super important related to these topics. So, and then Jason was just sharing with me that there's some things that he's been doing with his workflow, like tags and stuff that I'm not really familiar with. So that should be interesting to take a look at. So yeah, we look like we've got some people in the chat here. If you have any questions during the stream, as always, feel free to drop those in the chat. I see a lot of familiar faces here. Thank you all for coming through. Jason, your new look is it's great. People say they like your haircut.
Yeah, I've got the quarantine haircut. Makes life an awful lot easier at the moment.
I actually risked it a couple weeks ago and went to a barber and got a haircut. Everyone was wearing masks and we're all separated. Worth it.
Getting fed up of having to hide your head with hats throughout the course of the stream.
Yeah, exactly. There's always a comment about that, about the hat. Someone says you almost smiled at that comment. So cool, man. This is great. Look at that. See Louis here. Louis Torres, what's going on? A lot of other names. Hi from India. Hey, Vivek. Appreciate you joining in. Again, any questions related to game dev, Unity, all that, please feel free to shoot them our way. Next week, we got a video coming out on how to set up a project for unit tests, but we're gonna cover some of that today. So you're gonna get to see sort of like a sneak peek on that. That should be pretty cool. Look, it's so funny. If you look in the stream, our mics are actually here. That's hilarious.
It's the same mic too, as well, as if it isn't clear.
Super Zez asks, "How was the vacation?" Thank you, man. Thank you for asking. It was great. My wife and I, we went up to the mountains in Asheville, South Carolina, or I want to say it's, now I'm blanking. I think it's North Carolina, Asheville. We stayed on a sheep farm. This is pretty crazy, which is funny because I've been working on this sheep game, which is also a game that I've been promising to make for my wife for like years since we were dating. And then we stayed on this sheep farm. I wonder if I could pull up the video and show it. It's really funny. There was 120 sheep, and we stayed in like a little cottage. And at one point, the shepherds brought us out. Here's a video. I'm going to put it up and see if it's you can even see this. Let me hold it. It's probably going to blur out. Maybe I'll post it up on Discord. So anyway, there's like a whole bunch of sheep running towards the camera, and maybe you can see it. Yeah, you can probably see it. Look at that. So it was pretty funny. And so when we were on the farm, my wife and I were talking about the sheep game, and we learned that the sheep get moved from paddock to paddock every 8 days. They have like these sections of the farm. And I was like, oh, that'd be kind of an interesting game mechanic to where like, just as you get the sheep into one paddock, maybe there's like a shepherd there that's like, you talk to them and it's like, okay, now we got to move them to the next one. And then, I'm sure there's all sorts of game mechanics and challenges as you herd the sheep to another paddock. So it's pretty funny. But yeah, thanks for asking about that. Appreciate it. It was much needed R&R. Oh no, Void, appreciate that. Says just got into bed, but he can't sleep, but knowing that they'd be missing Infallible Code content. Oh man, that's really sweet. Appreciate that. We're gonna stream for about an hour and a half today. So if you can just hang on for another hour and a half, then you can go to sleep. Cool. Microsoft.
Fabio, yeah. I'm not entirely sure I understand your question. What do you mean a limit of rows in each class? Do you mean like number of lines per class? Well, if it is lines, then there's not really a hard and fast number. The general rule is you want to be able to see what a class is doing, basically in a full-size monitor. There used to be rules that were guided around how many lines you could fit on a terminal. So that's what the old saying was. You want one screen size worth, but that means a lot less these days when you've got 4K monitors, which you can display hundreds and hundreds of lines on a single screen. So pragmatically speaking, I usually try to aim for not having more than one scroll bar, like a little area. As for actual numbers, I probably cap out somewhere around 300 lines. Would be absolutely max I would have per class. It's kind of arbitrary though. There's not really a set rule. Realistically, you'll find very few mechanics will be more than that if you're actively making it separate in terms of what your features are. Any class that's more than 300 is probably doing more than one thing.
Yeah, and it's one of those things too where you shouldn't, as you're coding and writing classes, you shouldn't be looking at the line number, concerned about how many lines are there. You should be focusing on the structure of the code and separating responsibilities, and from that, symptomatically, you're going to get smaller files. What's that? There's like a concept. Someone brought it up in a stream a couple of weeks ago where you have too many classes, like too many tiny classes. Forgot what the term they used for that was. Like class explosion, was it?
Yeah, that sounds familiar. I can't remember.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other side, of the flip side of the coin, is sometimes you can get a little too granular, and you can have these classes that are just so dialed into one specific responsibility that you just end up having hundreds and hundreds of classes that all do one little thing. And obviously that's the other side where it can get out of hand there too.
I will say though, there's a common misconception people have where they associate number of classes with the kind of complexity of a project. So just because something has a lot of files doesn't mean that's a bad thing, right? Like if you literally, a big project will have lots of files. So it's not really, it's an odd thing to judge a project by the number of files you've moved it into. Because conceptually, as far as the compiler is concerned, it's one giant file. No matter how many times you split it up, it's going to be read and processed as a collection of instructions in linear order. At some point, it'll be interpreted into intermediate language, and that's going to be a literal linear pile of steps. So keep in mind, the point of splitting up the files is for your organization. It's supposed to make your life easier. And it's weird to judge the worth of a project based on that. The idea is simply, if it's hard to read, split it up into more files. If it makes it easier to work with, split it up into more files. If you've got too many files or it's not easy to work with, maybe don't split it up into lots of files, right? Like it's not something that should ever really be considered as much of an important aspect or metric for code.
Yeah. Someone asked, can you write a game using functional programming? Sure.
There are games out there with functional programming. I wish I could have some examples on hand, but I don't. But trust me, there are people are doing it. You'll be able to find some examples if you search.
Yeah. I don't have much experience with functional programming personally. It's interesting how that topic I've found on the internet can be polarizing.
Yeah, it's too contentious to be a topic I ever really like to get into, because
so strange.
Treat it like it's like it's cool, but it's a tool. It's a tool in your tool belt. There's no reason to treat it like it's some sort of replacement for object-oriented code, and there's also no reason to consider it as some newfangled crazy thing. It's just another way to write code. It's really, really good for writing the kinds of code where you're really trying to make sure there's no side effects. So if you're doing stuff that's running in thread environments, it's really nice to have code that's atomic and doesn't have that sort of weird state stuff that can happen. And if you're writing code that is very algorithmic, so if you're writing stuff that's like processing things through a series of steps, it's really, really good. If you're doing, there's so many cases where it's really valuable. It's harder to use in situations where it's very state heavy. That's not saying you can't. You can actually do an awful lot with functional programming, and you can sort of simulate state with the whole structure of how it works. But the problem is, you end up having a lot more boundary lines and application sort of endpoints. So what I mean by that is, if you're copying lists around and moving them, you have to clone lists every time you use them. Now, there's a lot of really clever stuff in functional languages specifically, which can optimize for that. but still, and if you look into performance in video games, you really want to avoid doing things like copying list contents, especially when you don't need to. So it's not really ideal from a memory management perspective for games. But as a, I guess, academic exercise, it's pretty good. And you can still make games in it. You're just not really going to see very tightly memory managed games done with functional programming. At least I don't think so. But it's not something I know well enough to be an authority on the topic. I just know enough to do a little bit of it, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting, the spectrum, of opinion on that when it comes to developing games. You have the no code camp, who just doesn't want to have anything to do with code. Give me Game Maker, or let's do visual scripting. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have some people with the opinion that, oh yeah, functional programming versus object-oriented programming, and there's just so many disparaging paths that you can take. And I think really, I guess the older I get, the more I just realize there is no right answer. I mean, the right answer is what's right for you and your project, and that's always hard to hear.
That is one of those things that I think you learn a lot as you start to become a developer for enterprise type stuff, right? Like if you're making a game, you're working traditionally in one environment, in one platform, in one engine. If you do work where you've worked on some web projects and some API projects and some desktop projects and some Android projects, and after a while you start to realize that a lot of the stuff that you take as sacred is sort of language specific stuff that doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
So realistically, for people who know one language, you'd be surprised how easy it is to learn another. And I've said this before, but you have one language, it might take you 6 months, maybe a year, like worst case scenario, to learn a second language. Your third language should take a couple months at best. Your fourth language should maybe take a month. And then after that, you're looking at a month-ish, maybe 2-3 weeks, depending on the language. And so once you realize that, you realize it's more about pick the tool for the job, right?
Yeah.
Like you can build websites using everything from Java and .NET, but realistically, you probably want to pick something that's more like a mean stack or a JavaScript style approach, because that's what most resources will get you for, And likewise, your desktop stuff, you probably want to be working with the .NET stack and be using .NET Core or something. But so it doesn't matter specifically what languages or what tools or what. I don't understand a lot of this evangelism around certain stuff. I'm a C# guy. I love C#, but that's because I like the syntax and I know it very well. But I will still make something in JavaScript if JavaScript is what's needed,
It's to bring it to some sort of other example, maybe it parallels to hey, I like writing poetry. I like writing fiction. I like writing nonfiction. At the end of the day, people have ideas, and people are creative and want to create things. And how you do that just depends on you and what you're trying to get out of it. And I think, bringing it back to programming and especially the business world, a lot of the driving factor is typically money. In fact, right now, my day job, we're in a crossroads where we have an application that's written on a very dated technology stack. And so we are struggling with, should we try to upgrade this technology stack to the most recent level? It's AngularJS. Or should we just rewrite the application using another technology stack that everyone on the team is familiar with? So it's the weighing is, it's really not about the technology stacks. No one cares about AngularJS versus Grails, which are the two frameworks we're in between. It's more of what's going to be most cost effective? What's going to be faster? We need to sell this thing. We need to get it out. It needs to be secure. And so that's what's driving the process. There is no sort of I'm going to die on the hill of AngularJS because I love JavaScript and it's an upcoming language. No, it's we got to get this thing out the door and it's got to be maintainable. So I think the same applies to game dev. And I know a lot of people use things like game makers, and maybe there are some purist programmers who are scoff at that. But you have someone like Thomas Brush, who's a great artist. And if he were to try to learn programming and do all that and really dedicate the time to that, he probably wouldn't be able to put out the games that he has. So I'm thankful that there are those tools that he can use, and now he can lean on other developers, potentially. And this goes for other game creators too. I'm glad that there's those tools that maybe I would never use, but it enables them to create games. So yeah, it really just depends.
Yeah, and also it's one of those things that there's a bit of a stigma around visual editors, and it's kind of funny because there's a lot of games that you don't realize that are made with visual editors. One that came up very recently for me is I just wishlisted a game. Let's see if it's here somewhere. Um, I never know how to navigate my own Steam profile.
Yeah, no, me neither.
I don't use it enough.
I'm gonna turn up Jason's mic. I heard. Actually, Jason, can you turn your mic up a little bit?
I'm at max, unfortunately. So yeah,
Okay. I'll try to give you some gain on my side. I have a gain filter for you because this happened last time. But let me know if that if he's a little too low.
I'll try to speak up as well. I do tend to speak relatively low. I'm trying to stay slightly further away from the mic anyway, because the kinds of mic that myself and Charles has a tendency to get very boomy up close, and my room isn't very well treated. So I've noticed it can get a bit muffled if I'm too close to the microphone.
I see a question here. How'd you both, I saw it come through once before, how'd you both get into Unity? I got into Unity just as sort of for fun. I work right now in the business and enterprise world, so I program really boring compliance security applications. And one day a coworker and myself were like, hey, well, I'd be really cool if we could like write like a little chat app. So we can chat to each other, because we were really interested in networking. So we wrote that, and it was console based. And I was like, I'd love to like give it a UI, so we can actually see and like get more sophisticated. So we literally just Googled different front end I guess frameworks or whatever, and like I came across Unity, and I was like, oh, let's just use Unity. I didn't even get it for games. I got it for that little chat app, and we put something together, and I was like, oh, that's really cool. So then I started using it more and more, and at that time, I never thought I'd make games. Like that wasn't even on my radar. In fact, I think at that time I was a little holier than thou when I came to that, thinking anyone who would say, oh, I want to make a game developer, I would just be like, you know what? That's so unrealistic. You're never going to be able to do that. And so, but lo and behold, I got into it and I started making little prototypes. And then that led to an opportunity to work with a subsidiary of Disney Annual Pass. So I did some contractor work for them, created a little game. And from there, I just have been doing contracting jobs, never really got into a studio. But as you all know, it led to me making infallible code. So that's kind of my journey. And here I am today. What about you, Jason?
Well, for me, it was actually the Oculus Rift mostly. So I was working in enterprise and had been for a while. I'd done the rounds between making Android applications, Windows 8 applications. I did some JavaScript backend stuff. I did some SQL database stuff there's a whole concept called business process management, and it's basically internal software solutions. So I did a bit of work on that. But it's all pretty dry, right? Like it's not particularly fun stuff to do. And so I backed the Oculus Rift, thought it was a pretty cool idea. After a while it arrived, and I started playing around with making my own stuff with it. And it was really, really simple. The early days, getting VR to work in Unity was as simple as a simple library that you just drop in and it works because it would just track to the camera. It was just a glorified camera controller. There was obviously, that's making it sound simpler than it is. There is a lot of, shader stuff that goes into it. It actually rendered two cameras and could do a whole lot of weird stuff. But I guess my point is, as someone who was new to both game development and VR development and even just Unity in general, I was amazed at how easy it was for me to open a project, drag in a few things, press play, and I have a virtual environment with 3D space I could play with. So I started messing around, and at the time, there was a really big maker community of just people doing silly stuff. So this was back when the Oculus subreddit had like less than 1,000 people, and people would post their experiments in Unity. So every week there'd be 2 or 3 random, like dodgy zip files of different projects people had been playing with to try out different things and what would work and what wouldn't. It was a pretty exciting time. And so I started doing the same thing as everybody else and started making little test projects. And I used that as a chance to learn. And while I was working on it, I noticed a couple of more skilled artists than myself would produce stuff. So there was one guy, Nick Pittum, and he made, if anyone's ever tried the VR Ghibli demos, he's the one who made those. So they're effectively the Studio Ghibli environments. The places from Spirited Away and from Howl's Moving Castle. He made like really cool 3D environments in VR you could explore. And I thought this was really cool. I was like, wow, this is, a movie I like. I get to stand in VR. This is very impressive. But his code sucked really, really bad. And I don't mean like an academic sort of, oh, your code's not as pretty as it should be kind of stuff that sometimes we fall into.
Yeah.
I just mean literally mechanically speaking as a game, it wasn't very easy to work with. A good example of this is he was using raycast for selection, which means you had an invisible pinpoint sticking off your nose that's meant to select what you look at. And it was extremely difficult to select things. And I was like, look, let me help. Like I can do this kind of stuff and I can help you out with it. So I said, I'll do it for free. I just like your projects. I want to make them more user friendly. So he said yes. I worked with him for a little bit, and then he ended up having a game jam, the Oculus Gear VR jam, and he wanted to enter that. And he had a team of people, and they needed a programmer. They didn't have any, and I was like, okay, I'll do that. And so, long story short, worked on a few things in VR. Ended up getting contracted because he had a bit of kind of cachet to his name, so he would get offers for do stuff, and he didn't code. So effectively, I was being dragged along for the ride, and then after a while, it started to become a thing that we just worked together. And now I also got a bit of a name for myself doing that too. And then lo and behold, I'm getting contract offers to do various VR and Unity stuff, and then I blink and I've been a Unity dev for 5 years. It's usually it's kind of how it went. So
nice. That's cool. I feel like that is a common story, common thread. Like, you kind of dabble, you talk to some people, you get hooked up in the right community, you work together, and then next thing you know, it's, word of mouth is super powerful. Especially, and I think, our niche is pretty small, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
So and a lot of people ask, kind of to go on a tangent, a lot of people ask, oh, how do I get a job as a game dev? And I saw a good question here I wanted to answer from Renew about, what's the best way to show your projects on a portfolio. And I think really word of mouth is so powerful. Being involved in a community, and not as a lurker, but as someone who contributes and then works with that community, I think word of mouth, is going to lead you inevitably to finding paid position, whether it be contract work or maybe full-time job or. And to answer that question, by the way, I think, there's obviously a lot of answers to that. How do you, what's the best way to show all your work, to position your portfolio for potential employers and partners? I think I really got to say, I like GitHub, and I like how, I think if you, work on your GitHub account, treat it like, this is my opinion, treat it like your LinkedIn. I don't know if any of y'all on LinkedIn, you should definitely, if you're looking to get a job, probably should be on that and make sure that that's all, your summary, your experience, all that's fleshed out, put all the keywords, all the things you got to do. Pretend you're a YouTuber and you have to make everything sort of clickbaity. I think if you treat your GitHub profile in the same way, you star your projects that you want to be seen, and you work on those README files, include images and GIFs of your game and an explanation of what it is or your prototypes. I think that's super powerful. And I think,
yes.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, so yeah, and on that note, like a lot of people are asking, okay, I get it, I should share the stuff I work on, but what do I work on? What do I do? What do I share? And to tell the truth, it doesn't really matter, because from my experience, the way it works is somebody will eventually need something. And you can even spot this yourself as a content consumer of how you probably found Charles's channel. You probably had, I want to do X, I want to shoot a gun, or how do I do physics or a box collider, or whatever silly thing that you were working on. You would Google it and you find content of someone doing it. And this isn't just true for sort of small snippets of mechanics. This is how people tend to connect in general, which is somebody, and this is like how a lot of the projects I worked on come from somebody who saw work that Nick had done visually, like they liked his art style, and they wanted to hire him because they know he can do that kind of art style. And so that's how we get a project. And so if you make things, and I personally would say I recommend doing stuff visually if you can, because quite frankly, games is a visual medium.
Yeah,
even if you are a programmer, learn how to do things like render lines, or learn how to do stuff like just basic shader stuff, so that you can take your cool code ideas and have some visualizer for it. So, and actually, just to prove the point, I might as well link this to you, Charles. You can drop it up. It's my mechanic a day thing I was working on. But yeah, my point is that it doesn't matter what you make, but just make it visual and put it somewhere. And if you put it up somewhere, people will see it. It'll give them ideas, and they will work on it, and they will they'll kind of go, "Oh, I want more stuff like that. Can you help me with this thing?" And that's how you connect. So it doesn't matter. Just pick a thing you like. Do you like AI? Do you like colors? I know, silly it sounds. Imagine doing a color library that does like cool effects that can transition skyboxes, or that has like interpolate between different. It doesn't matter. Like, pick a thing you like, make stuff for it, and just make a lot of visual content. And you'll find you'll connect to people by doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very much an organic process, or it can be. It can be organic. So cool. All right. So I see a question that's a great segue into the topic of the video of the stream today, which we're going to take a look at project structure and some things like that. But before I dive into that, just wanted to friendly remind you to invoke that like button. It really helps if you're enjoying the content. There's two ways that you can really help support, and that is hitting that like button and also leaving a comment. That is, and I don't, I'm not saying to just drop a comment if you can't think of anything, but if you have a question that didn't get answered, or a suggestion for something you'd like to see, those comments are great because they allow us to see what the community is interested in and sort of tailor that to that. So we don't want you to just drop a comment arbitrarily.
Yeah, as a side note on the questions too, like I said, sometimes we'll look back over those comments and we will use them as ideas for videos, or we'll use them for kind of aggregating ideas of what people want to see. So
exactly,
it's definitely valuable. Like we genuinely do read through pretty much every single comment that's added. It's just unfortunately there's not usually a lot to say on some of them because they're kind of commenting on specific stuff. For example, like on older videos, it's very hard to comment on stuff that's fundamentally changed when it's the technology behind it's changed. Like Unity changes a lot of its stuff frequent enough that sometimes it's hard to answer those questions. But if you leave comments on videos, we will try our best to answer whatever questions you have.
Yeah. Okay, so down to the matter at hand. Felix asked a question. I saw that some Unity projects have a underscore project folder in the asset folder. Yeah. Can you recommend it? Okay, so that's going to just bring us right on over to. So I'm going to share my screen now.
Not only do we recommend it, we do it ourselves.
Yeah. I wish I could make this a little bit bigger. And but anyway, hopefully this is easy to see. If anything, I can probably up it to 200% zoom. But anyway, as you can see on the left-hand side, this is our project pane here. Actually, you know what I could do? I could probably switch it to the horizontal view and maybe, yeah, there you go. That's a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to jack up my UI here, but you can see that in our assets folder, we've got this project folder. What is that? Well, you can see we've got a couple other folders in here too, like this Demo Giant, Text Mesh Pro, and that should give you a hint as to why we have stuffed all of our scripts, scenes, fonts, editor, animations, all those other folders that you normally associate with a project. The reason why you can see them in this underscore project folder is because every time you pull in an asset from the Unity Asset Store, for some reason, a lot of asset creators don't follow the rule. And I think it is in the documentation that whenever you upload an asset to the Asset Store, it has to be in a plugins folder. A lot of people don't follow that rule. And then so what you do is you get a whole bunch of these annoying folders in your main assets folder. And it can get really messy. So that's why.
Yeah, in an ideal world, you wouldn't do it. But to be completely honest, I find that there tends to be stuff that's project specific and stuff that's just various assets and tools. Mm-hmm. And I like to draw a very clean line and say, this is the stuff that is required that I have written or I have made for this project. And so having that underscore project is very much, this is this project. Anything outside of this folder technically isn't this project. It might be various plugins and assets and whatever, but realistically, the code or the models, the prefabs are in here for this project.
Yeah. Now, I've never run into an issue with this, but one thing that I had done in the past, I don't really mess around with it these days, is like I'll just create a plugins folder and then just drag those things in, like drag Text Mesh Pro. But then, I've heard where it's like, oh, if you want to update your asset.
Yeah, I don't for that reason. Yeah. Because whenever you update stuff, now, to be fair, a lot of this is moving into the packages folder anyway, so it's making life a little bit easier for us. But it's going to be a while before I root. Like, there's no downside for me to do that. It just basically, it's like, all we're saying is instead of using the assets directory as your root, use underscore project as your root from that point on, and just pretend anything outside of that doesn't exist.
That's
On one
a
note,
good way to put it. Yeah, that you don't use the asset as your root folder.
On one other note too, before we go too far down this rabbit hole, there's a really interesting. I forgot who phrased it, but someone really made me think about how I approach the project tab, and it really changed my mind. Which is, someone pointed out to me once that it is not a folder view. It looks like a folder view. It conceptually feels like a sort of file explorer. That's not what it is. It is a project view. It is a view of all of the stuff in your project. And what that means is, if you forget about the fact that it happens to be conceptually in folders, that shouldn't matter, right? The point of this asset, this project view, is to give you access to your assets. And so you should do that in the way that makes the most sense and is easiest for you to do. And a lot of people naturally organize and sort through their stuff by using the directories, but they kind of forget that there is a search bar. And so if you get into the habit of just typing, whatever the object is, like just write mat or shape, whatever, you like immediately find stuff, right?
Yeah.
And if you're thinking, oh, but now there's all this stuff and I can't really see it, all of the buttons on the top right there are designed to be filters and various different things. So you can hit those.
It's funny, you can actually search the asset store here.
Yeah, you can, if you want like free assets and stuff. Yes, you just pick a category like scripts, and you'll just find your all your scripts with cheap in it, right? There's a million ways to use this thing that isn't do specifically with just searching or with just using this file system. And so if you keep that in mind, you'll realize that this whole concept of a project view is a lot more powerful than you think it is. It's just one of those things that you take for granted because it looks inherently like a
look at that.
Yeah, you're beating me to it. I was going to say, so one thing you can do is you can mark stuff as favorites that you're doing regular searches. So if you've got a search where you're getting all of these different things, most people don't use these features. They're here.
I don't.
People don't use them. Another example is if you have click on the sheep script there for a second.
Oh, here.
And if you go to the
I'm guessing this here,
the little blue dot on the bottom right under asset labels. You see a little.
Bottom
on the right side.
Oh, here.
Yep.
And let me move this over so people can see it, because I know that our cameras always cover it.
Oh yeah.
So I'm in the inspector at this point. This is the inspector view.
So that little blue button. Yeah, there you go. So just type in something like, we'll say character. Yeah. So you have associated the label character with that script, and it doesn't have to be all the same types of thing. Anything that's to do with characters, you could put that little asset label on it. And then if you want, you can just click the label, you can search for that label, and you'll just find all of the stuff with that asset. So the thing is, there are a million ways to sort and organize and filter and find. And
very nice.
I guess my point is, don't get too precious with the idea that your folder structure matters that much. Like you can get really caught up in, should I do it this way? And should I do it this way? And the answer is, it doesn't matter, because the whole point of it is to make it easy to find. And so give yourself as many ways to do it as possible.
That's a really good point.
There's only one difference I would say to that. I personally sort my asset folder with one goal in mind, because it is an underlying folder structure. I don't care how it looks as a folder structure, because that's something that, like I said, I can search through a million other ways. But the one time I do care about the structure is if I want to add or remove a feature. So if there is an entire concept, we've put ducks in our game, we've got lots of duck related stuff, and then all of a sudden we're like, you know what, scrap the ducks are gone. I want to de-duck my game. And so it would be really nice if you could just click the duck folder and delete it, and not have to go through 50 different things and type duck into the search thing, have to delete all of them and make sure you find them. So in that one instance, I like to say stuff is vaguely categorized by the type of thing it is, or by the category of what it, not the type as in whether it's a material or script, but more so whether it's to do with a topic or category, so that I can quickly and easily move it, delete it, transfer it to projects, and that kind of thing.
And that's everything, right? Like that's assets, or rather like textures and scripts related to ducks and animations. Like, would you say that you would have like a ducks folder that has kind of a similar format? Where you would have...
I tend to use that sort of cyclical thing where it's ducks would have duck scripts, duck materials, duck prefabs, and so on.
Interesting.
Now, all of that being said, there's one last bit about that, which is slightly different, which is we've discussed before. It's things take a little bit of a different turn if you start leaning into using assembly definitions.
Yeah.
Because in that case, the folder structure does matter, because you're actively, the way Unity assembly definitions work is the folder structure defines what assemblies are built to. and I don't think we ever demonstrated this, but we probably should do it one day.
Mhm.
But if you use assembly definitions and build your project and then go into that folder,
Yeah.
you know that assembly
Yeah.
-C#, it won't be the only one. Like
Yeah.
the whole point is that all of those,
We
there'll
can
be
show that.
additional .dlls. Yeah. So we can go over that. But anyway,
I will say, by the way, to that comment you mentioned, there's something called assembly definition references. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that allows you to kind of get past that. You can have like a subfolder deep in your project that's associated with an assembly kind of in another. Granted,
I haven't really played with those much myself, but then again, as I think I've mentioned before on a video, is that personally, the whole point of assembly definitions, it's a hack to give you back different DLLs that you because it's not a feature that's easy to do in Unity normally, but you can just do it yourself. Just like open up Rider, make a class library, make a DLL, drop it in, and you get all of the same stuff, except you're just doing it outside of Unity. That's a personal preference. That's how I prefer to do it, but it's the same thing.
I kind of like to explore that because I haven't really, I have in the past, but since I've been really messing around with assemblies, I always just do it in Unity. I'm curious to see the workflow of doing it from Rider. So maybe
because the thing is, most people think it's like, oh, I'm going to have to go build a separate Rider project, build it and drop it in. It's like, no, you can open up the .cs proj file, and it's just an XML descriptor of all of the different parts of the project. And there's actually a pre-commented out section. So if you go to a .cs proj file on any project and just open it in the text editor, there will be a commented out piece of XML at the bottom that says pre-build, post-build. And if you basically take the post-build one and open it, there's a little snippet of code you can paste in, and you can effectively do like an X copy that will copy the on finish of build, copy these things to this place. And so I tend to do that and do a relative directory. So I tend to have, this is my Unity project. In the same folder, I also have my the class library project. And then what I do is I say, when the class library project is built, go up a directory and then back down to the one with the u dot prefix of the same name. And then from there, go in one more directory to plugins and then drop your DLL in there as well. So just by the nature of having the two connected, anytime I build my class library project, it'll automatically build a DLL, drop it in Unity, and by adding a new file into Unity, we'll re-trigger a build in Unity, and all of a sudden it works. So,
someone says Charles hasn't said anything about Rider yet. Are you feeling well? I love Rider.
I should get my Rider pin for one of these days.
I know. Over there. Yeah. You know what? Actually, I'm wearing my Rider shirt. I don't know if you can see that.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
I love this Rider shirt. You know what? I have a whole bunch of them that I'm supposed to be giving away. So maybe in a follow-up stream next week, I'll do a giveaway of my Rider shirts. I've got pins too. So thank you for bringing that up. I love Rider. I'm in contact with someone there, and I really need to reach out to them and see if we can't do some more stuff for the community with Rider.
Yeah. Like I know it's a joke. A lot of people seem to think that you're like officially sponsored or whatever, but at the end of the day, it's just simply a better tool. Like, if you've been doing Unity work as long as I have, and I know it sounds like I'm saying 1,000,000 years old, but no, it's been 4 or 5 years. That's long enough to say that I've got a bit of experience in it. And we all remember using MonoDevelop. MonoDevelop was a nightmare.
Nightmare.
It was a horrible text editor. It would crash frequently. You didn't have basic features you'd expect out of a text editor. And so, for those of us who came from a Visual Studio background with like a full qualified text editor, it was like, this is great, but how do I get this in Unity? And so, you could open the projects in Visual Studio back then, but it was a nightmare because you'd end up having these really weird issues where it would cause locks. So, the act of changing your code in Visual Studio would cause it. Unity would do a rebuild, which would lock your scripts, which would then throw exceptions because it's trying to save files that are being read by Unity and locked. And it's like, the way file systems work with actively run files is terrible. So there was an unofficial plugin made for Visual Studio to connect to Unity. So you actually had to install this thing into your project and do a bunch of reference stuff and have this like build process step where it would build one and wait and do the other. And it was this unofficial hack to get Visual Studio to work. And it was great, but it was really, really slow because now you have to wait for this double cycle of the compiling and building of your scripts. And again, this is before assembly definitions, so you didn't have a way of chunking your code to build smaller. Unity would rebuild your entire project every time you so much as put a full stop in a script. So it got really, really tedious. And so what did you do? Well, again, Unity, it sort of scaled up a bit. Unity officially bought that plugin and built their own first-party one, and slowly had integration with Visual Studio and moved away from MonoDevelop. So now Visual Studio became the de facto solution. But again, it's slow. And even with Unity's help in optimizing it and using Visual Studio Community Edition, which is even lighter, you would still have a really long turnaround time between the two.
Mm-hmm.
So why did I go through all of that? Well, because Rider looked at that problem and it added support for Unity natively, and it's fast, at least comparatively speaking to everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And it works natively, and a lot of the stuff that you expect is there. And they added quality of life stuff that no other plugin had, like the ability to see the serialized values in the inspector inside your
That's
script.
so wild.
And it's like, it's such a mind-blowing little detail that saves you like, I've spent hours debugging because the value that I could see in my script is 10 is technically actually 20 because it's 20 in the inspector, and I don't know this when I'm editing my code. So why do we like Rider so much? Because it literally saves us hours of time. It's a very good tool, and we don't need to be sponsored by them to try to express to people that it is a better solution.
Although I'd love to be sponsored by them.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of Rider, I think let's start working on this project a little bit, and I think we're going to end up there very soon. Before we do, just wanted to kind of show off what we're working with here. It's a little cheap game. It's really not complicated. We'll go through a little bit of the code, but you can go up and down. It uses DoTween to do a little jumping animation, and I'm using WASD for movement. Not really that complicated. And so the main files that we're going to take a look at here, sheep, we got a sheep class. The player class is what controls the sheep, acts as a controller. We got this direction class, a couple of extensions. We're not even using the game for this because I've gotten rid of all that fluff, just hopping around. So if we look at the code, I'm going to pull up the sheep class, for instance. We can see, for one, what you most likely see in your Unity project, if you don't really mess with assemblies or namespaces, is that you're just going to have all your code like this. And it's funny, looking at this, I've basically stripped my project of namespaces. This looks so weird to me. Yeah. Like, it looks so weird that it's not.
I admit, whenever I don't see an enclosing namespace, I get a little bit uncomfortable. It's something I'm so used to at this stage.
Yeah. So here we are in Rider. Someone asked, what's Rider? They're answering in the chat. I appreciate that. But in a nutshell, it's a really... You're looking at it. It's like Visual Studio, which is an IDE, which stands for Integrated Development Environment. And basically, it's a tool for writing code, but this particular tool, Rider, has native integration with Unity, like Jason said. And you can see there's a whole bunch of little call outs here. You can see that you can click this and see all the times that sheep is used. These are actually, in assets. If I had serialized fields, they have little call outs to that as well in the UI. You can see here, this says frequently called code because it just knows that this is being called in an update method somewhere, which is pretty interesting. So there's all those really cool things that you've got there. And then of course there's a bunch of other features, like you can see, why does it say my name? A lot of people ask, why doesn't it say Charles Amat? Well, because I have GitHub integration, or rather Git integration. And you can see that now it's saying, oh, who edited this file? And you can see all the times that I edited the file.
Yeah. So if you've got a team of 6 people and you're all working on the same project, it's really nice to say who wrote this last bit, and you can then have a look and compare stuff. As for people worried about price and stuff, if you are a student, you can get it for free. They literally will give you. They have student offers.
Yep.
And they'll give you access to it for free for the duration of your education, effectively. And then if you are a sole developer, it will cost you money. Like, it's not going to be free. But honestly, it's the difference between somebody doing it as a hobby and doing it as a job, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're being practical about this, I can honestly say, unironically, you're going to save hundreds and hundreds of hours of your life. Because over time, over the space of working on a project for 2 years, all those little things you have to go back and forth, and all the time you're waiting for something to compile, and all the times that you're sitting there confused about why stuff is, happening or whatever. When I say that the price is around, I think it's 150 or 200 for the year. That is basically an entire year. Ask yourself how much you think you're worth. Mm-hmm. And if you think it's going to save you more than 10 hours over the course of a year, which I'm pretty damn sure it will, because it saves me probably like 10 times that. If it saves you that much, it's worth the price. And that's basically all. That's the only math you need to do. Do you think, if you're in a position where you're trying to make money by doing game development or using Unity or using this kind of stuff, then putting in that investment is pretty small in the grand scheme of how much benefit you'll get for it.
Yeah.
But again, free for students, so
free for students. To worry about it. And if you happen to have graduated and you still have access to your student email, read between the lines.
Yeah. Cough, cough.
All right, so definitely use Writer. It's awesome. We're going to see some more of the quality of life features that it has as we go through this. All right, so what I was mentioning earlier is like we don't have a namespace, and if you're not sure what a namespace is, interesting. How would you define a namespace? It's like an organizational tool that you use to basically, I don't know, cordon off each one of your scripts into its own space.
I tend to call it a box.
A box, yeah, that's fair.
Like if I've got a bunch of scripts and they're all, so for example, let's stay at the very top here. We're building something called Sheep Game or Sheep Adventure, right? So you make a box and you call it Sheep Adventure, and then all of your Sheep Adventure stuff goes in the Sheep Adventure box. Then inside the Sheep Adventure box, you've got lots of stuff. Well, some of that stuff is going to be dealing with saving your game and managing all of your data and that kind of stuff. So maybe you're going to have a box called saving system. And so inside of your Sheep Adventure box, you've got your saving system box. And in the same box beside that, you'll have your character controller and movement stuff. So you might have character box. So you've now got your Sheep Adventure box, and then you've got your movement box, and you've got your kind of persistence and saving box. And then, long story short, your namespaces is that chain. So if I'm holding up a script, I said, where does the script belong? And you just look up the namespace, and it says Sheep Adventure dot saving dot whatever. It's like, oh, that's where it lives. Simple. Box in box in box.
And there are other boxes that have code, like there's a Unity engine box, as we see here. There's a system box. All of these are namespaces that we are referencing, boxes that we are pulling into our code base and saying, hey, look, you can pull some code out of that box, pull some code out of that box. Mm-hmm. What's good is that in those boxes, you might have classes that share the same name. For instance, like I created a direction class. This direction class that I created, it isn't associated with any other box right now. But if the Unity engine happened to have a direction class in its box, well, then you'd have a conflict. The editor or the compiler wouldn't know which direction you're referencing. In fact, because there's no namespace here, I'm pretty sure that it would say that I'm not allowed to create a direction class because there'd already be one in the Unity engine box. Yeah. So what we'd have to do there is I'd have to say, okay, fine. I'll take this direction. I'm going to put it in a box called Sheep Adventure. And then now there can be two direction classes. And when I use them in my code, I can tell the compiler, hey, I'm going to use my direction from my Sheep Adventure box. So that's kind of one of the big important things of having namespaces.
And so the other thing too about namespaces is that there's a lot of stuff in programming which is implied and kind of invisibly added before and after various things that you write. And one of them is the path to your namespaces. So take line 7. We've written public read-only vector3 vector. So there is this concept somewhere in the world called a vector3. And like I said, it's in a box somewhere, and we just happen to know it's inside the Unity engine box. Now, you can write right in front of it. You can even do this as an example, Charles. Just write Unity engine dot vector3. So change line 7 so that it prefixes with the namespace. So that is what's technically there. Now, Writer will gray it out. So it'll tell you that you're already, like this entire file has included that Unity engine. So it knows it's needing it. But you don't need to use using statements at all. You can replace all using statements with this very manual Unity engine dot thing, Unity engine dot thing for everything. It's just unwieldy. So instead of doing it in every place, you move it to the top and you say, just implicitly assume I'm putting Unity engine in front of everything.
We actually got a really good example. Random is a great example because there's a system random and there's a Unity engine random. So if I were to pull system in here, see how we have a red line? A
collision. Which one do I need? There's two randoms. Which one are you trying to make?
Yeah, so it's gonna ask me which one am I using, and because I'm using both of these boxes, Unity engine and system, and both of them have a random. Now I have to explicitly say, hey, I'm going to use the random. And one way to do that, just to be more simple, is I can call out, say, I want to use Unity's random. So then I'm telling it, we're going to use Unity's random. Or as you may have seen, what happened just now is when I actually use the editor's help menu and to do it, there's this thing called a static, what is it called? Like
Oh, you can either do aliases in this case.
Yeah.
Aliases.
Right, an alias. So I think it's called static something, or in Java you use like the static keyword, but in this case it's like an alias. I'm going to say, hey, whenever someone says random, I'm going to point that to Unity Engine dot random. And if you wanted, you can make this whatever you want. So you can call this, UE random. You can it's arbitrarily nameable. You just call it UE random in case you wanted to use both randoms in one file and give the other one S random. Which I rarely ever see, but hey, I'm sure it happens in some.
Yeah, I usually avoid it because the whole point is that most of these tools are there to make your life easier. And if you do this, you're going to confuse people. It's simple. If I have two cases where I'm using multiple randoms, I will prefix the namespace. I will just write, this one is literally system.random as opposed to this one, which is literally Unity Engine.random.
Exactly. So hopefully that's enough to convince you all that namespaces are valuable. So what we're going to do is we're going to give our entire project what's called a root namespace. And that's just all of our classes are going to be associated with this root namespace. And really, most projects can probably get away with just doing that. And you're good to go. You don't have to go in and get crazy about adding a whole bunch of namespaces for your persistence and maybe I shouldn't say most, because now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think that's actually true. I think there are plenty of projects that could get away with it, but I think if you learn to use namespaces, even small projects can really benefit from leveraging them.
I know it sounds silly, but I often recommend people do it anyway because it helps conceptually when you start moving stuff around.
Yes.
So if you're like me and you have a lot of scripts and a lot of projects all over the place, if you're sharing a script with somebody, you can just share the public class sheep portion. But if you share it and it's got a wrapper around it called, Sheep Adventure with the namespace, you're like, oh, that's part of the Sheep Adventure project. I remember now. That's where this came from, because that's what it belongs to. So I think even as a subtle thing, it's just a good idea to have a global namespace anyway. Not just because it's going to help you avoid collisions, because again, you don't know what you're going. Like a very good example for this is you might write a health system or literally just health, public class health, and you're like, there you go, I got health. And then later on down the line, you say, oh, there's a really nice health bar asset that I want to use. Somebody's put on the asset store.
Mm-hmm.
And because you can't rely on other people doing the stuff they should be doing, you will download this into your project, and all of a sudden your entire project is a load of red errors because they have in their own health system something called health, which happens to collide with yours. And it may seem like a small thing and you don't really need namespaces, but honestly, is it really worth the pain in the ass that's going to happen when at some point someone happens to have decided on the same name as you? And let's be real, there's a lot of names people write in game code which is pretty identical. There's a lot of players, there's a lot of healths, there is a lot of saving and various different like grid and map and game and game manager, and like you are going to collide with other people's code at some point. And if you just put a nice wrapper around it and say this is Sheep Games or Sheep Adventures version of these things, you can completely avoid any future headaches.
Yep. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's wrap our project in a namespace, a root namespace. Now, you'd think I would want to do this from Rider, and you could, if this was a traditional project, you could go to solution, and you can see here that we've got this main solution that's called Natalie's Sheep Adventure. It's my wife. And we've got these 3 assemblies. One of them is .tween, has its own assembly, which is great. Good for them. There's this editor.
It drives me insane you call it .tween. It's do tween.
Do tween.
Doesn't make any sense. It's automated like teller machine.
Rip in peace. .tween. So you'd think you'd be able to come in here and say, hey, I'm going to make this the root namespace infallible code, right? Or Sheep Adventure.
Yeah, and so one of the questions is, how do you choose it? It's the name of your project. Your root namespace is literally the project you're in, whatever.
Or if you come from the Java world, it's your website, but backwards. Do not
do that. Yeah.
Infallible code. It's so dumb. I hate Java.
Yeah. So for people who don't come from a Java background, the convention in Java is to name it com.yourname. Whatever the project is, which is insanity, because as you start to grow a project, the namespaces tend to get quite long, right?
Yeah, very verbose.
You get like 4 or 5 deep, right? So let's be real. As long as the whole point of it is that it serves a purpose, and the purpose it serves is to wrap what you're doing. Now, again, there is a method to madness. The reason Java used to do this is because it was actually your website, and it was very good for documentation. Like you could literally be using some code and go, how the hell do I find out more about this? You could literally type in the URL that came from the inverted version of the namespace, and you'd be able to find out all the stuff you need to know about it. We don't need that anymore. We live in a much more efficient way of of using the internet.
Documentation can be built right into the editor.
Yeah.
Oh, Java.
So yeah, don't do that. Just use a nice name of your project. Yep. That'll do fine.
So I can't actually do this from here, by the way. I just wanted to call that out. Even though it does have the setting and you can hit OK, Unity is going to regenerate this SLN, and when it regenerates it, it's going to regenerate it without the root namespace. So you have to do it from Unity. You have to set the root namespace from Unity. So we're going to go to Edit, and then we're going to go to Project Settings. And then in the, there's all these tabs. If you go to the Editor tab, and in fact, I think you just do a search on it, root namespace. There it is. We've got root namespace, and it's even under the C# project generation tab. So now you can say, hey, whenever you generate my project, make the roots namespace sheep adventure. Spell that right? Yep. So we'll save that. And now when we go back to Writer, we should see that if we go to properties, it says infallible code. Well, I'm sure if I close the project and reopen it, it would say sheep adventure because it's going to regenerate. But in this case, it did not. But that's just a pro tip there. I have set this from this part of the editor, from Writer, and it's been overridden. I'm not sure at what point Unity decides to regenerate. Maybe I would have had to change some code or something. But yeah, that would get overridden. So now that we've done that, you'll notice, hey, all these files, they don't have sheep adventure. What's the story here? Well, we would need to add those in. And if you're using Writer, you can do that very easily. If you just right click on the scripts folder and hit refactor this, you'll see that there's this little menu and it says adjust namespaces. And so because Writer now, the assembly now knows that the root namespace should be sheep adventure, if you do that, it's saying, hey, do you want to adjust all these? You hit next. And then it's going to adjust all those namespaces. And there you have it. We have sheep adventure.
And now this highlights as well something interesting, which is a lot of coding standards will tell you that your namespaces should match your folder structure.
Right.
And that's probably generally good advice because it makes things quite clear. I don't do this, but for very particular reasons to do with dividing boundary lines that I don't want to get into, that's well beyond the scope of this. But I will say, just as a small note, and you'll notice this as you start to expand things, if you were to make a subfolder in the scripts directory and call it something like game or
let's call it saving or something.
Yeah, saving, it's fine. And if you made a file inside of the saving folder,
database.
So you'll notice it'll automatically, it's now sheepadventure.saving. It is helping you out by saying, I see I see you're making stuff in the saving subdirectory, so we're doing it for you. Now, this hopefully answers a question that came up a while ago, which is why are you calling it box and not namespace? Because narratively, it makes more sense to explain it this way. It is a folder which is automatically being used to kind of categorize your stuff based on namespace. So for people who aren't familiar with namespaces, I like using the term box because it very clearly defines that you can see it visually now, right? Like there is something there. Scripts is what it's called here, but basically imagine scripts is actually called sheep adventure. That's the root. And then underneath that is saving. And so subsequently all future folders will be matching that name structure. So if you have multiple nested folders, your namespace will be nested down that hierarchy.
Now, fun fact, if you want to, if you don't want to follow this for whatever reason, and I've actually already done this with the scripts folder and the project folder, you can right click on a folder. And now this is Writer. I'm not trying to do this in Visual Studio, but you can go to properties and you can say, this is CS as namespace provider. If I uncheck namespace provider, now it's going to say, hey, the namespace should be sheep adventure because this folder no longer acts as a namespace provider. Again, if I turn that back on, it's going to complain. And you can see that in my scripts folder, I've turned off namespace provider, and also with the project folder, which is something that we mentioned that we do. I've turned off the namespace provider for that as well.
Or what I'd personally like to do that again so it turns yellow there, John. So now if you hover over it, it'll actually give you a little warning. And so for people who aren't familiar with what these mean, yellow means here is something you should look at, but it's not really going to break anything. It's just it's usually some small thing you should look at. And in this case, if you look under inspection in the middle, it's telling you what it is. It is saying namespace does not correspond to file location. And you can look at why it's saying and all that kind of stuff.
If you click on this too, it'll actually take you to
it'll bring you to Writer. And this is why, again, you don't need the bloody com dot structure because you can just do this and move on quite nicely. But that one at the top just stays disable once with comment, right? You can disable it, or you can, my personal favorite, one down just underneath that is configure inspection and severity. You can just say, do not show this. Personally, I don't care. I like to control my own namespaces. I don't want Writer ever to tell me that my namespaces are wrong. I can do it myself.
Yep.
So that's another option. You can just outright say, stop.
Bugger off.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Hey, Raven, and don't worry if you missed the stream, man. We got a VOD coming up after this. You can rewatch it. Thanks for joining us.
I hope that this demonstrates that namespaces aren't scary, or they're not some super complicated or only for Leaf programmers. The point is, it is a structure that's there to help you, and you shouldn't be afraid to use them. And it as you can see, it's like 3 clicks.
Yeah.
Just do it once. Forget about it. Even if you never do anything else other than just have a root namespace, just have namespace Sheep Adventure, namespace My Game. That alone will save you any future risks colliding with third-party assets. That one thing alone is worth its weight in terms of all of the other stuff we talked about. There's more interesting stuff you can do with it when we start talking about dividing project DLLs and stuff, and being able to have like code that can be compiled at runtime, and you can drop plugins into your project and have it automatically load up new code. There's lots of cool stuff you can do that requires you to sort of divide your namespaces. But none of that matters yet. And the only thing that really matters at the moment is just put a root namespace and it'll make your life easier.
Yeah, totally. I see a question. What about DDD, which is
domain-driven
development? Yeah. In terms of game project structure, I don't know that domain-driven development really applies, because I feel like that more is when you've got like a database and you've got tables that have a whole bunch of information, and you just want to say, hey, given the domain of, for instance, a person, like you might have a person in a database and it might have first name, last name, social security, credit card numbers, but like in the context of like a profile, you only want to show their first name, last name. So you create this domain object that represents, hey, a person, but for a profile. And then maybe for like an ordering, you want to look at a person in the context of an ordering or a cart. Then you might want to say, I want to get their first name, last name, but I also want their credit card information. So it's like in games, you don't really have a concept of taking like a domain object and seeing it in different contexts. It just is what it is. You got your player, you got your sheep or whatever, and it doesn't really, there's really no contextual changes.
Yeah, and the other thing too is it's kind of confusing to explain to people, but when you talk about a domain, the closest analogy you can get to when talking about Unity is your domain. You're in Unity. That is your platform. That is a lot of stuff when people talk about dividing your code and trying to, like, this is why it's so weird to me when people misuse MVC in Unity. And that's a whole different talk. But the point is, MVC is designed to separate your presentation layers from your data and that whatever. But technically, Unity is your entire presentation layer. All of Unity. That's what it is. So it makes no sense to put an MVC inside of your presentation layer. It's kind of an odd thing to do.
It's funny, like, I think that was a concept even for me that took a while to kind of grasp. But like Unity is just a renderer. It's got everything you need inside of it. I mean, obviously there's times where you kind of want to overcomplicate it and provide more sophisticated tooling for your particular project. But generally speaking, you can do a lot of what you need to do just in the editor. Aaron says, I want to learn codes, but I can't. No, man, you sure can. Anyone can learn code.
Yep. Just all you have to do is start.
Just got to start. Yep. You look like you had something to say.
No.
Okay. All right. So we've got a root namespace. That's a good first step.
It may only be like one word, but I really hope that we've demonstrated that there's a reason we took a lot of time to go over this topic, because it's one of those things that you'll, like, I think without even going, I just want to nail in the idea, because everybody's done this, and maybe you didn't realize why this happened. Have you ever installed an asset or a Unity package into your project, and all of a sudden there's errors, just lots and lots of errors in the console, and you're really annoyed, and nothing works till you delete the folder that was added, and then everything's fine again?
Yeah.
That is literally what this is. That is the problem, where certain files are expecting other namespaces and they're matching and confusing or whatever. That is most of the time that's what that is. There's other things that can happen that cause that issue. But honestly, most of the time that you install a project, it's because either something has changed with namespaces, or it's because there aren't namespaces and things are colliding. So you've seen this happen in your own projects. And so putting this one thing in place just avoids that issue. So it is very important. And that's why we're putting so much effort on describing just the concept of a namespace.
So Raza says, so can namespaces and ASM files help in badly coupled code? Well, they will. So if you're working on a project and you are using namespaces and you are segregating your code and drawing system boundaries, what we call it, in that case, yeah, that does help with poorly coupled code. But just adding a namespace to your project, by virtue of adding the namespace, isn't gonna fix your poorly coupled code. You need to separate that code, and that's where namespaces and assembly definition files help you really create those boundaries that are really hard to cross. So yeah, inherently, if you add a namespace, a root namespace, it's not going to help your decoupled code. But
well, you can kind of tell how much of an issue that's going to be, because if you do use assembly definitions, a lot of stuff will just all of a sudden magically stop working and get it very confusing. Because if you've got tightly coupled code and you put a single assembly definition in as you start to build up your project, all the assembly definition will say, oh, I can't talk to that. Oh, I don't know where that is. And all of a sudden you'll have to start like wiring the different components together, and you'll get a really good sense that your messy code is messy code, because the way the compiler will work will highlight the flaws in your architecture, because
Right.
it'll like full on refuse to work until all of the connections make sense.
So to kind of, I guess, to kind of show an example of that, we already made a folder called saving. I deleted it, but I guess in our existing code, trying to see if we can draw some sort of a boundary here. I mean, I guess one boundary would be like the game doesn't really need to know that there's such thing as a player or an NPC. It just needs to know that there are sheep and needs to know when they've entered the pen. So that could be a good opportunity to draw a boundary and say, hey, look, NPC and sheep, NPC and player, those are concerned about sheep controlling. So maybe those can be in their own namespace. Definitely like persistence and saving, that could live in its own. It doesn't need to know about what's provided in the code. Another thing that you could say is, hey, there are some things that are fundamental here. Like direction is pretty fundamental. This min max is just a helper thing. Extension methods. You could say that these are core. Maybe these are core elements that should be shared across the entire project. Maybe you create like a core namespace. Now, I did see that earlier on in the stream, someone had asked about the word core, and
yeah,
is core a good idea? I never really considered that using the word core would be something that, I think he mentioned that Microsoft documentation says not to use the word core. Have you come across that?
I hadn't seen that before, but it makes sense. Although I would say as well, they do have their whole concept of .NET Core, which is probably adding to the confusion.
Yeah.
But I do agree that for the most part, there's no real need to arbitrarily have, because the point is, right, like using the box analogy again, the point is stuff is in a box. If it needs more detail, it goes into a smaller box. And so if the root level box is your sheep adventure, it's kind of silly to arbitrarily say, oh, this is all the stuff that's in the sheep adventure box, but not because we make it smaller. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you can just leave it there if it is part of that project.
Right.
I don't tend to make core per se, but what I do tend to do is a .common in a lot of cases.
I like that.
If I'm using stuff that's shared, but then it's not sheepadventure.common, because that's no sense, right? Because like sheep adventure is specific.
Yeah,
I tend to have like, whenever there's something which is cross project, I usually create one that's just my name. So namespace is JSON story, and that's my root for all of my code that doesn't have a home. That's like, it can go to any project under any context. And then under that, I would have a JSON-story.common. So that's the stuff I would use for all of those kinds of projects. And then I might have other variants. So I'd have stuff to do with sequencing things or animating things or whatever. And so I would have exactly like Unity. And you can see this again, like to kind of circle back on how Unity, like if you want advice on how to use your namespaces, look how everybody else does it. Just write system dot, for example. We'll look at how Microsoft themselves do it. There you go. So these are, if you scroll down, a lot of these are types, but you can tell once you start getting down to the icons. So let's get to the collections is one of them. So if you can get to,
I could just type in and get it.
Yeah, so see that little back and forth, the two brackets? That symbol represents a namespace. And effectively, again, like folder, if you go dot, and if you scroll, and they'll be easier to see here.
Here we
see
go.
those ones at the bottom? So you're literally seeing how Microsoft does it. Systems, it's system
Generic.
stuff, dot collection stuff, dot generic stuff, and then here's a bunch of types, and it doesn't go any deeper than that. So these are all the types inside of it. So this is them structuring it in a nice, neat collection of, here is the entire Microsoft system. Here is the collections that exist in the Microsoft system. Here are the collections that are generic. And without going into too much, the reason there's a .generic is because the original collection system for .NET 1.0, there wasn't the concept of generics yet. So they added .generics as a later addition. And that's kind of the point of namespaces, right? Because you can add stuff under other categories without really messing with your structure.
Exactly.
Conceptually new stuff. And Unity, once you check Unity as well, it does the same thing. Unity engine dot. And if you press up, it'll drop to the bottom, and you can kind of see usually near the end of the list. And also all of these blacked out things. There we go. Yeah, here we go.
VR.
So these are all the namespaces.
Deprecated, right?
Yeah, all the deprecated stuff. So this is the namespace. You're seeing Unity engine dot. There's some UI stuff. There's some VR stuff. There's some XR stuff. There's some scene management stuff. There's some social stuff. I have no idea what that yoga is. So you can kind of get a sense now of what the different components are. Yeah. And so if the question is, how should I sort my namespaces? Well, just look at how everyone else is doing it.
Yeah.
And that's predominantly me, whoever I am, whatever my entity is. Am I Microsoft? Am I Unity engine? Now they're calling it system because it is literally every system, but effectively pretend that says Microsoft. It's Microsoft. And all of their other stuff like Microsoft code contracts and all their other namespaces go under Microsoft. And actually, here's another thing. Go to references there, Charles. Click add reference in your actual view. Yeah.
Here, yeah, right?
Yeah, just add reference.
Up here?
Yeah, there should be an option to just right-click add references. Oh, it's because you're in the...
I got add. Oh, am I in the Unity one? Maybe I got to go to solution.
Yeah. Yeah, dependency. You should be able to right-click and add references.
Yeah, add reference.
There you go. That's the one. So here is all of the namespaces that are natively probably on your operating system.
Yeah.
And so you can see what the systems in your computer are using. So there's system.net, system.whatever. And there is some of them that's like system.windows. And there's other ones, system.microsoft. There's a whole load of there's other ones, Microsoft. Whatever. And so any company that you're using a namespace for will be like that. And hopefully you're starting to see why these namespaces are important, right? Because these belong to certain companies. They're an entire subset of stuff that's kind of nudged away and into that entire category.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're Microsoft.build. So that's Microsoft.C#. There's all these different subcategories of namespaces.
Yeah. Cool. So I think we've driven it home, and I think that, in this case, for this project, I don't really think there needs to be any other namespaces because of how simple it is. But I think to give it opportunity to explore assemblies, what I could do is we could create a unit test, because testing in Unity, it does depend on having assemblies set up. So imagine we wanted to write some tests for, the easiest one is this direction class, because it's just a POCO and it doesn't rely on being in a scene to run. It does reference a vector, which is part of the Unity engine, but otherwise it can just be your basic edit mode script. So let's go back on over to the editor to set that up. The easiest way to do this, by the way, is if you can go in and create your own test folder and all that. But if you just go to the general tab and hit test runner, there's going to be this test runner window, and it has some helper functions. If it doesn't see any scripts or tests in the folder that you've selected, you can go ahead and just create a test assembly folder, and you can do that for both edit mode tests and play mode tests. So when I'm at the very least, what I'm going to do is just create a folder called tests to put both different types of tests in. And I'll just start with edit mode tests. So I'll just click on edit mode here. It's going to say, hey, do you want to create an edit mode test assembly folder? Say yes. And I'll just name it edit mode over here on the left. And you can see it actually created an assembly. So an assembly is like, let me not open that up in Writer. Assembly is like a namespace, but just a step up, where an assembly is a box within one bit of code, and you can have multiple boxes in one code base. An assembly, if you had multiple assemblies, actually breaks up your code into different DLLs, distributable pieces of code that get compiled into their own separate archives. And so in that way, it's really hard to cross those boundaries, because when you just use namespaces in your core project or your project, you just reference the other namespaces. So like, let's say like we saw there was the saving namespace. If I needed to get access to that .saving namespace, I would just reference it wherever I wanted to. There's no big deal. But when I separate that persistence namespace into another assembly, I can't actually reference it unless I give the DLL a reference to the other assembly. And so that extra bit of work really does take it to the next level. And so we can see that here.
And specifically the term DLL stands for dynamically linked library. And that's so that if we break that up into individual parts, the term for it is library to start with. So what is a library? Well, that is the collection of those different scripts. Mm-hmm. So a library is like a little bundle of scripts that you can then pass around with a kind of with a boxed name. So namespaces, there's a very strong relationship between namespaces and assemblies, as Charles was saying, but that's kind of out of scope. But I do want to say that the important part is the dynamically linked portion. Why bother with DLLs? What's the point of it? Well, it's the dynamic linking that we're discussing. If you've got a DLL and it references another DLL, you can basically build this hierarchy chain where this thing and this thing have a connection, and then there's another thing over here which has a connection, and it's basically like a little tree. So this has connection to these two, but these two know nothing about each other. They can be worked on independently, deployed independently. The code is really, really easy and separate because rather than talking to each other, they both have a DLL that they work with and kind of defer and talk between. And that starts to get very important when you start thinking about things like multiple platforms. And you've seen this if you've ever done any VR work or even multiple platform stuff in Unity. Unity does this and you'll even see the checkboxes right there under platforms. You can have DLLs per platform. So you take the entire chunk of code that deals with a particular concept like saving or high scores or whatever, and you can say, this is all of the high score stuff that specifically talks to the Google Play implementation of high scores.
Right.
This is how to save files, but specifically on iOS devices. And so you don't have to muddy your code base by having to deal with the case of like 4 or 5 completely different things. You can just say, this one is the iOS stuff, this one is the Android stuff, and all I need to do is say save and then pick the right DLL. Whatever platform you're on, use your DLL to solve this problem.
Yeah. And as you can see here, we are looking at, it's called the ASMDEF file, ASMDEF file. And this basically, in Unity, when you add this assembly definition file to a folder, it's going to treat all the code in that folder and subfolders as part of a single assembly. And then as a part of that, you can edit certain things. Like Jason was mentioning, you can say, hey, this DLL, I only want this to be built for Android platform. And so Unity, when you select the Android platform, it'll include the DLL. But if you were to go ahead and do it for PS4, build for PS4, then that DLL would not be part of that build. And then you can see, and this is something we're going to come into soon, that you can actually reference other DLLs. So in this case, we've got this edit mode assembly. And if I were to go ahead and just add a test, and if I go to an easy way to do that again is to go to the test runner and say create test script in current folder. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to call this direction tests because we're just going to test the direction. You'll see that when I go into this folder, and let me just delete all this boilerplate code so we don't have to worry about it. If I try to, let's say, just get a direction, remember direction lives in the sheep adventure namespace, you can see that I actually can't access it. There's direction in Unity engine.ui slider, direction in Unity engine.ui scroll bar, direction in...
And so this is another great example. Unity, because again, Unity is a big company with multiple different teams. 3 different systems, completely separate and independently, have a concept called direction. Mm-hmm. And they all do this by having their direction inside of their namespace that they work with. And so it's just literally proving what we were saying earlier.
Yeah, it's a testament to like there's so many words are so common, and in this case I can see a whole bunch of them, but I can't see mine, and that's because the test. Just delete this. The test lives. This direction test class lives in the edit mode assembly. And something that's interesting, if you click on any script file, so I have the direction test file highlighted here, and look at it in the inspector, you can see there's an assembly information section, and you can see that it belongs to the edit mode DLL. So when we build this project, and we'll do that soon, we can look in the resources and see that there's going to be an edit mode. Well, actually, probably not. I don't think tests are included in builds. But at least once we make another DLL.
Well, yeah, literally. So here's a fun fact, because I actually didn't know this myself till I looked into it. The runtime, the editor time DLLs that you build do not process assembly preprocessor commands. So funny fact, if you decompile the assembly C# inside of the Unity engine folder, not the one in your game build, but like in the actual editor version, all of those assembly preprocessors are still there. So every version of it is actually in it, including all of your editor code and test code. And that's why you only get those errors if you accidentally reference editor scripts in a runtime script when you go to build it for real, because that's when it actually runs the deciders for which things get included or excluded from your preprocessor.
That's interesting. Yeah, I always like pulling back the covers and seeing things like that.
If you have .peek installed, we can demonstrate that.
Let me see if I have it in my toolbox. Well, we can mess around with that later. I'm not sure if I have it in there.
Yeah, it's fine.
I might have it, but
we'll add that to another day.
The next stream, yeah. If you want to see that, drop it in the comment. Drop it in the comments. All right, cool. So we have this edit mode test assembly, and you can see that the direction test is a part of that. If we scroll up to the assembly information, but it can't actually reference the class that we want to test, which is directions. So the easiest way to do that, and I'm telling you, it's super easy. You just right click on your scripts folder, whatever you want to turn into an assembly, and then you just click on assembly definition. Boom. You name it whatever you like. In this case, I'll name it Sheep Adventure because I think that's the root of my project. That's that namespace I used anyway. So I don't know exactly what the best practices are, whether you want to call it the name of the folder, like if I should call it scripts or if I should name it after my core namespace. But in this case, I'll just name it Sheep Adventure. And then if we open it up here, we can see we've got it in the inspector. There's nothing too fancy about it. But if we start to click on these other scripts, if we click on direction, now you can see under the assembly information, it's going to be a part of the Sheep Adventure DLL. Let me delete this real quick because I forgot to show you. If I delete that.
Oh, as a small side note, because it came up as a question in the chat. So one of the questions is, what's unsafe code?
Unsafe code.
So for starters, unsafe isn't just like, mean or dangerous. Unsafe is literally a keyword. There's a lowercase keyword in C# called unsafe. And what's fun is you can actually write unsafe curly brackets and then write some unsafe code in there. Otherwise, if you're writing unsafe code, the compiler won't let you. It'll actually tell you, we won't build this because the code is unsafe. What does that mean? And have you seen it before? The answer is yes, you literally have seen it before. Because if you've ever played Pokemon, the original, remember Missingno? Missingno, which is actually missing number because there's no ID for that particular Pokemon, is a literal example of what happens with unsafe code. Because what happened was, we talked about, let's say variables are boxes too. We're going to use boxes a lot for this stream for some reason. So a variable is a box that has the number 10 in it. That's your health, right? And the whole point is that you play with the number and it goes up or down or whatever. But as far as a computer is concerned, in memory, those boxes are stored somewhere. It's like having a shelf with all of your stuff on it. And you keep thinking of it in terms of just playing with a number, but you're not. You're actually dealing with a shelf of stuff. And it may sound weird to say this, but if you've got a shelf full of all your variables, technically you could take something from one box and move it to the next box over. And it's not, from a computer's perspective, that's not hard to do. You can just take the value that exists in one position and just nudge it. And you can basically get into some weird scenarios. And so what happens is you take a value that's part of something like health, like it's meant to represent a number, and you push it into a category that's meant to represent inventory. And all of a sudden, the number 5 gets moved into the box, which is inventory IDs, which is actually your health value. And all of a sudden, you've got new items in your inventory. And if you watch speedrunners, there's a lot of really new stuff that's happened recently with Zelda Ocarina of Time speedrunning. And it's really funny because the way they do it is they do this trick where they pick up an object and they mess with the internal memory by moving around in particular ways, which effectively means the slot allocated in memory that's meant to represent what object you're holding when you're picking up an item gets changed. So when you throw an object, it'll land as a different object than the item that you picked up. There's some really weird stuff, but
That's awesome.
It boils down to you can cheese the game and win in a short period of time by not actually playing it at all. You spend about 10 minutes humping a wall and spinning and doing weird stuff, and then you throw something down and you end up with an item that you're not supposed to get.
10 minutes humping a wall.
Memory. So yeah, and yes, so as is pointed out in chat, you're getting into the whole concept of pointers and whatever. And I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole. I just want to say that like that is unsafe code is when code can do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And sure, it leads to some funny stuff for games, but if you're talking about a banking application,
oh gosh, yeah,
somebody messes with a number and all of a sudden your address overflows into the category meant to represent someone's bank balance. That's how a lot of problems happen. So unsafe code should really be kept at a minimum. It's only really used in particularly odd scenarios, like doing stuff where you're like if you're trying to mess with fan speeds or you're trying to optimize your computer processor stuff, you do actually want to work in unsafe space because you can do some really interesting stuff with memory that's far faster and more efficient. But you shouldn't if you're at our level, basically working on games and that kind of stuff. So don't play with that stuff is all I'm saying.
Long story short. Cool. All right, so back on here, we're trying to get access to the direction class within this directions test class here. I deleted the assembly that we had just created. If you look at the direction now, direction class and the inspector, you can see under the assembly information, it's now part of this assembly-c#.dll. And if we go back to Writer, you can actually see that right now in Writer, we've got this Explorer mode set to the Unity tab. But if we go to the solution view, we can see all the assemblies that are a part of this project. And here you go. Now we've got this edit mode assembly. And so that has our test. So this is, it'll build as a completely different DLL. And we've got the assembly-C# DLL. And that is actually just by default, Unity will put all of your code into this particular DLL. And if you have an editor folder, fun fact, it's going to put any class in the editor folders throughout your project into this DLL. And something that you may not have known, if you actually create a folder called plugins, and I'll just, for the sake of this, I'm going to drag DemiGiant into there. Should be some code in there. If not, I'll just put TextMesh Pro as well. If we go back to Writer, we should see that there is a different assembly in here. Let's see if it resyncs and builds. There should be assembly. This is throwing up. Well, there's another assembly called assembly-C#-first pass, and basically on build that will get build first. So I don't know, just some little gotchas. I'm not sure how to get that to show up in Writer. I've gotten it to show up before, but I'm going to pull these out so we don't screw ourselves over.
And so it brings to a good point, though, which probably mentioned before we go too far down this.
Sure.
Is what's the point of DLLs? Well, I guess the first thing to mention is DLLs are what's actually ran. DLLs are your code. So if you ever worked in Java, you write files with a .java extension. So player.java, sheet.java. In C#, you write sheet.C#. Now, Java is a little more visually obvious what it's doing. So you take this code you wrote and you pass it through a compiler, and a compiler does stuff to it and spits out a new file.
Right.
In the case of Java, it spits out a .class file. And a .class file is a compiled version of your code. Because you don't really think about it, but the computer doesn't speak the language you speak. And I don't mean English. I mean, it doesn't even speak C# or Java or any of this. Because the code you write, first of all, gets passed through a compiler. And the compiler looks at it. And then it takes away all of the nice code sugar that you've added. So for each statements don't exist in C# technically. You actually are using for loops, technically for each is actually using enumerators. But the point is, there's a lot of features you think are parts of the language that are not. They're just nice like editor stuff that gets stripped away as the code is compiled. So step one, remove all of that stuff. Any of those like nice interpolation syntax strings, all of that's gone. Next step, it does what's called lowering. So it takes the code that you wrote and it changes it to make it more linear. Because you write a lot of code using things like coroutines and enumerators. And again, they're not technically concepts that exist at a code level in terms of what the computer understands. So it takes all of that stuff and strips it back and turns it into case statements. Nice switches of if this do this, if this do this, if this do this. There's no such thing as an enumerator at that level. And then it goes one step further, and you now have code, which is the compiled version of your code. It does other stuff too, like it strips out stuff. It does some really clever stuff, like if it knows, if you say two values, like int a equals 5, int b equals 2, and then a plus b, and then do other stuff, and then that value is in a small scope, it'll figure out that there's no way for those two numbers to change, and it'll just add them together and set one variable. It does a lot of really cool little optimizations that says, you're doing a calculation here, but when it comes time to use this code, you're not actually going to need a calculation. So it does all of this stuff, and then once it's done with all of that, it then compiles it to a whole different language called IL, or MSIL for the Microsoft version.
What's that, interpreted language?
Intermediate language.
Intermediate language.
And this is what makes it even funnier. It's in the name. It's intermediate language. We're not done yet. We take that intermediate language, and then, well, it's also called machine code, so you might have heard that term. That's usually referred to at the IL level.
Right.
And then it's moved into something which is applied on the processor itself. Now, the metaphor I use for this, I think, is quite clear. You can write instructions for how to bake a cake, and that'll include you add milk, you add sugar, blah, blah, blah. But if you give that to somebody, they can't just do it because there's other stuff involved, which are like the human steps, like, grab spoon, grab bowl, pour it into bowl, like all these things. So that would be the equivalent of moving it down the layers until it gets to something that a person can use.
Like a person, like the recipe might say mix ingredients, and then the actual machine code would say pick up, step 1, pick up spoon, step 2, pick up bowl, step 3, spin spoon.
So that's the second stage, right? That's just moving it and getting rid of all of that syntactical sugar and making it more applicable. But here's the thing, even that technically doesn't work. You can't give somebody those instructions because where the spoon exists in their house is different, or where the bowls are in their house is different. So you take that now instructions that have gone from add sugar and milk to open the fridge, get the milk, open the cabinet, and then you go one step further and say, in your house, move to the left, go up to the thing, grab in the. That is what the last step is.
Yeah.
Because IL is handed to a processor. It is handed to your actual computer, and depending on what platform you're on, whether it's Intel or whatever the architecture is for it, it will choose how to interpret those instructions. Yeah. Those instructions are actually quite simple. They're take a number, add a number, subtract a number, do this thing. It gets really small at that stage. Yeah. You're basically talking about registers and whatever. But the point is how a system chooses to interpret those. That's how you can run code on phones as well as computers and everything else, because they all have different architectures. Yeah. An ARM architecture would be vastly different. So that's kind of how you get from what we're writing is a very basic how to bake a cake. And a computer has to go through a whole series of steps.
That's a funny analogy.
So with that in mind, what's a DLL? Well, a DLL is the box where someone has gone through all of that process, wrapped it up, and you can now hand it to a new system and say, this is ready for you. It's all ready now in IL. It's done, right? Yeah. So a lot of work has been done to get you to that point. And Unity is doing that for you in the background. So your scripts, every time you see that little load bar and it's going through all that stuff, I know, Carsten, we're not getting into just-in-time compiling. That is AOT, a whole other topic.
Yeah, I know. Oh gosh.
That's some really clever optimization stuff, but we don't need to go down that road. So, long story short, the point of a DLL is it is literally your compiled code, and it is the thing that is ran that actually makes stuff happen on a computer.
Yeah.
And when you start talking about the DLL portion of it, the dynamically linked, because it's code that runs on a compiler or runs on a processor, the dynamically linked stuff starts to get particularly important. So we'll get down that road later, but there you go. That's what a DLL is. So that's worth keeping in mind, right? Unlike the folder.
Coding with Unity makes a good point. To make an apple pie, first you need to create the universe. So there's a lot of steps. Yeah, there's a lot of steps down the line.
So it's basically, the only reason I want to mention that is because we may have given the impression that namespaces and assemblies are just like various shaped boxes to put stuff in. Namespaces are structural to kind of make things easier, but assemblies are like required.
They're like physical, like that is the thing. Yeah. That
is the actual code. So I want to make this very clear that assembly is like what you're actually building towards.
Right.
And like Unity, it's all in assembly. All the code you write is already in that the C#
assembly dash C sharp.
dash C sharp.
Yeah.
That's where it lives. So.
Yeah, by default. But now what we've done here is we actually created the sheep adventure assembly, and by virtue of it living in the same folder here as all these scripts, if we go back to writer, there we go. We see that now we have this other assembly here called sheep adventure, and there's a whole bunch of squigglies and errors, and that's because we're referencing things from Text Mesh Pro. And if we go to the sheep, I'm sure it's going to complain about DoTween, my bad, because those need to be referenced.
So hopefully it now makes more sense after that little rant I went on, that we're not just saying, oh, I can't see it anymore, because we're not just talking about one script in a folder beside the next script. It's basically saying, I have gone through this entire chain of stuff and ended up in a nice, neat box in a whole new language, and I can't see that one because it's over there. That's gone through its own entire process. So it's the reason it's giving out is it's literally in a completely different conceptual code universe at the moment. Right.
If we look again, this Text Mesh Pro, it lives. I'm not sure where it lives. Maybe it lives in the assembly -C sharp, or I imagine it would probably be in the assembly -C sharp one because it's in our asset folder, the TMP _ text. That whole
no, that's actually under the TM Pro.
Oh, it has it. Oh, yeah, it does have its own assembly. Okay, so basically we just need to say, hey, look, Sheep Adventure wants. Let me go back. Sheep Adventure wants to be able to reference this class that lives in this namespace, but this code lives in another assembly. So all we need to do is say, okay, let me go to my Sheep Adventure assembly, and we're just going to say, hey.
Well, have you? As a small side, have you created that one yet? Because you actually have to create the
the Text Mesh Pro
assembly definition for Text Mesh Pro. Yeah, open up. You know that window that pops up the first time you use it.
I think I have created it. I know that because I've been using this project as my tutorial. But
right.
Yeah, but so it's up here in tools, right? So people don't know. People might not know. Where is it again? It's not under tools. I got Demi Giant, which is DoTween. Here we go. Text Mesh Pro.
Oh, I thought it was there.
I know there's somewhere where it does pop up and it says, "Hey, do you want to create a?"
Maybe I'm confusing it because DoTween does the same thing. If you open up the DoTween panel, we can show it there.
I think it is DoTween. I think Text Mesh Pro is smart enough to just do it. Yeah, look, I can remove the.
You already have your assembly done.
I did that one. Yeah. All right, so let's go ahead. If you now we're in the Sheep Adventure ASM def file, and if we go ahead to this assembly definition references section, I can add one, and then we're going to just reference Text Mesh Pro. So we see Unity.Text Mesh Pro. They have editor, they've got tests. We just care about this root level one, so we'll add that. And for good measure, I'm going to just add the DoTween one. So we see we've got DoTween.modules.
So remember we talked about what DLL stands for, dynamically linked. Well, we're doing it right now.
This is dynamically linking.
Yeah, we're dynamically linking them together.
So when we apply that, now if we go back up to Sheep Adventure game, we can see that hopefully, there you go. It rebuilt the project or whatever the case may be, and now it's able to reference that. For some reason, my DoTween is still complaining. I must have effed
I've noticed
that
that Text Mesh Pro does that to me all the time. It'll technically still work. It'll turn red, but it won't stop any issues in terms of builds for me sometimes.
That's annoying. Let's go back to the Unity view so I don't have to look at
that. I think what you have to do is because it's based on the like build cycle for the two apps.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have to close Writer and then do the whole open again just to get it to like.
I know I moved it around by sticking it in the plug. Yeah. In any case, let me just close that. My computer's fast enough. I can probably just reopen this. Let's open the direction test file. And now what we're going to do is now it's the opposite way. So now the edit mode assembly still doesn't know about the Sheep Adventure assembly. So again, if I try to say direction dot, it doesn't know. It's hard to see here. It doesn't know. And Writer's cute enough to be like, hey, do you want to reference Sheep Adventure? But we're going to do it from Unity because I know that a lot of times you need to do it from Unity because it gets overridden with generation. We're going to go to that edit mode assembly here. You see it in the inspector, and we can see the assembly definition references a couple of other assemblies already, a couple of other DLLs. We've got Unity Engine.TestRunner and Unity Editor.TestRunner. So I'm just going to add our Sheep Adventure. So you can see now it's there. We'll add Sheep Adventure, hit save or apply. That's important. If you don't do that, I've done that a million times. I'll switch back to Writer and be like, oh my God, it doesn't work. You have to apply it. And then if we go back to Writer, now we should be able to say direction. And there's Sheep Adventure right here. And it has a different symbol. I wonder what the story is there.
That's because it's linked. Like literally, it has linked.
Okay, fair enough. So we'll do that. And now you can see I can reference all the, which I didn't really dive into, but basically direction has the ability to, it has a bunch of static properties that represent cardinal directions. But now you can see that I can reference it. And if we look up in the using statements, sure enough, there's my Sheep Adventure namespace, which is now available. So yeah, I'm not going to write a test. I think we've gotten to a good stopping point. We're an hour.
Well, there's one last thing I want to cover.
Sure, let's cover that, and then we'll call it.
Again, it would be really nice if you did have .peak or some IL viewer. If you don't, it's fine.
How do you do it? What's the steps to do that? Just to make sure I have it or not.
It's an app, like it's a separate.
Let me try it. Let me .peak. Oh, I might have it. So something's opening. 2019.3.
Yeah, there you go. Cool. You have it. Nice.
Right.
Okay, so just make one quick script in your project here. And we're just going to call it game controls or something. I'm going to just do a really tiny thing here.
Okay, game controls.
So do a update statement and just do a if the escape key. So yeah, when we get to .peak, it's a free tool, so it's worth knowing.
And
inside of this, what we're going to say is application.quit. Cool.
Okay.
So this is, if you've never seen it, how you quit a game. Oddly enough, most people don't actually put quit code in because it's pretty funny. They don't usually think to do it.
I'm sorry that it's so tiny here, by the way, guys. I don't think there's a way for me to zoom in.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. You can zoom in once you've actually opened the script. I'll show you in a second.
Okay, cool.
None of that matters. That's just the assembly. Things fine.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you run this, I just want to highlight something. So drop it into your scene and just run it.
Where is my scene view? Oh, here it is. Hierarchies here. All right. I'll just add this game controls.
So this is our one line if backspace quit game. Now run this. And if you press escape, nothing will happen.
I'm hitting escape, guys.
The reason nothing will happen is because that doesn't work in editor. That works when you've got a built application. And this can be very annoying because it's very hard to tell what's actually going on. Now, head back to our script. And just for a second, comment that line out. And replace it with editor application.
Did I quit?
It's is playing equals false annoyingly because Unity has to be obnoxious with some of this stuff. Right.
Wow.
Now, run it again.
Ready? 3, 2, 1. Oh, nice.
Quits the
beautiful.
Editor.
Love it.
So that's really cool. You're like, oh, I did a thing now. I can quit the editor when I press escape. That's kind of cool. But here's the side effect that you didn't realize that just happened when we did that. Head back over to the script and look at the top. Got two using statements. One of them is now using Unity Editor. What does this mean? Well, this means that we have just included the Unity Editor in our build, which means technically, if Unity would let us, when we built the game, it would have to build the entire application and the entire editor to access that scripts that exist in the editor just to give you that one line of code. And obviously, you shouldn't do that, and so it doesn't let you. It'll tell you you cannot make a build of your game if you've included the Unity editor in your build. So what do we really want? Well, what we really want is if we're using editor stuff, we want that to only work while we're in the editor. But when we build the game, we want to take that code out. Mm-hmm. Now, we already know our code goes through this entire compiling process. So Unity knows how to do a little bit of sneaky rewriting of your code before it uses it. And so we can actually tell it, this stuff should only be included in the script at the time with which you are actually running it in the editor. And so the way you do this is use something called a preprocessor command. And hopefully now you'll see why it's a bit different than a normal statement. So if you, now here's one people forget. You have to start with the namespace because the namespace will be included and that'll throw an error. So hash if, and then we can basically say, there's a whole load of them, but I think the one we want is
editor.
Yeah, we'll say Unity editor. That's fine. Yeah. And then at the very end, hash end. Is it or else?
End if, yeah.
End if, yeah. So now what we've said is that line of code will only be in this script when you're running it in the editor. And I don't mean, I really want to stress that why this is different. What that's saying is it'll literally take out that line of code when it comes time to actually build your application. And we can prove this. If you now do an else, so you've got hash if Unity editor, you can do a hash else. No, not there, at the bottom one. That one's fine. You just want the...
Got it. Yeah. I know. I'm going to put that down there, so I'll do else.
You have to do it in between the end if. So if, hash else, hash end if. Yeah. Now, notice line 17 is grayed
out. Yep.
Because it's actually telling us at the current build version of the application, the DLL that Unity is building secretly in the background as you type, it's why the little build goes up, it is a version that is technically Unity editor. So that grayed out line isn't actually in the script at the moment. It looks like it, we can see it, but literally it's not really there. And this is where I wanted to kind of show that if we can, if you could build this project and open it, open up that DLL, we can demonstrate that fact.
So I'll do build settings, got the game scene, just do a build, see where that puts it. All right, cool. I'll just drop it in this builds folder. Looks like I've already built this before. I'm gonna delete these, so refresh. So select the builds folder. Okay, that should do it.
Cool.
Is it doing it? Something's happening. There it is.
Oh, I should have actually demonstrated it. If you left it open, it will give. If without that, it'll. If you put using Unity editor, it'll crash when you do this.
Oh, it'll crash?
Well, not crash like the editor, but it'll give you the red error and go. Can't.
Got it. All right. So here's the Can I zoom in? Here are the results of that.
Yeah. So head over to the underscore data.
Yeah. Resources. Manage. My bad. You're right.
And then it should be your.
Yeah. So we should see it in here somewhere. I'm just zooming in so it's easier to see, hopefully. It's not really, though, is it?
So these are all the DLLs that are in your project.
And one should be called Sheep Adventure.
Yeah. And if you hadn't done the process we just did, where we did the assemblies, it would instead be called the assembly, assembly-C#.
All right. So I should be able to open up .peek and just drag it in.
Yep.
There she is.
Double click it on that when it comes up. And yeah, there's your namespace, and here's all your scripts.
So that was game controls.
Yeah.
Give that a second.
Okay. So here's what I was talking about. So the first optimizations is it's doing what's called guard
look
clauses.
at that. That's cute.
Yeah, because
it puts guard clauses? I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
That's hilarious.
The reason why is because it's doing linear steps, right? So your code is easier if it can do exits out of ops because it doesn't think about the rest of the code. So it doesn't do these giant ifs because it's not how code works.
Yeah.
So it reverses your statement, does a guard clause, and notice it's got none of the other stuff that we included because we've specifically said don't include that stuff when we're actually making those scripts. And here's the fun thing. So
this is compiled script, by the way, guys, just in case it wasn't clear. This is
technically to be specific, this is a decompiled version of the script. If you actually click the button in the top left, see up there where it's got a little up top left bar. Yeah, the icon bar, that one there. Show compiler generators. You'll also see that even though Unity doesn't let you use them, there is actually a constructor.
Nice.
Because it's added by the compiler. So if we had a single coroutine in here, things would get a lot crazier. You'd see when you press that button, your code would triple in size. But that's a whole different. I don't want to get down that road. All I'm getting at here is there's the code we wrote. It's gone through a whole lot of processes and it strips out a load of stuff. But this isn't even the code that's in the DLL. So I talked before about it goes through all these processes. This is decompiled, which means it is reconstructed back into the code we wrote. But that's not what it looks like. If you right-click on that script there anywhere, Charles, there should be an option called IL code. And this is the real code. These are the actual instructions that are being ran.
That's cool.
And so you'll see here, it's not as confusing as you might think. Now, if you hover over any of those IL underscores, you'll see that they're all named. It'll give you a description of what it does. Or sorry, the labels to the right of it. So it tells you transfers control to a target instruction. Now, all of these are kind of fairly straightforward if you think about it. That's basically saying return false. The one called call calls another function, right? and the other ones are like pointers and returns. But if you think about it, it kind of reads roughly the same, right?
Yeah.
It is saying call this, return false under this condition, otherwise return true. Call this function, return out of it. There's other stuff in here too,
Right.
and it gets more interesting as you start to add more code, especially like loops and other kinds of things. But the only reason I wanted to show any of this stuff is to demonstrate that the whole process of building DLLs, this is what happens. This is where it goes, and the whole thing of why you need to do this and why you need to have DLLs and stuff will start to become more apparent once you realize that you're actually talking about this sort of like whole separate box of separately compiled code language, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, you can pretty much take any DLL on your computer. You can grab any DLL you find and
drag
drop
it in
here,
here,
have a look at the code. Yeah.
So this is .peak. It is free, from what I understand. I guess.
And there's a ton of them. It is free, but there's a ton of decompilers.
There's .trace. Oh yeah, true that. There's other ones that aren't by JetBrains, but
yeah, there's like a bunch of free ones. On
soon to be sponsored by JetBrains. Just gonna put that out into the universe. We're just gonna use .peak.
And actually, it is kind of fun if you've got any Unity based games on your computer. You can basically go if you basically do a search on your computer for assembly-C#, because 90% of game devs do not use namespaces, you will actually find that root DLL across every single project, and you'll be able to like take a look at
shoot, Neversong, I'm coming for you.
yeah. No, I was going to say I've already that is unfortunately not namespace, but it's the same thing. Like you can kind of look at any code, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, very cool. Cool. Yeah. That's great. I mean, it's interesting to go through the steps really, because this isn't even an exercise that I personally do very often, but it's great to see this. And I'm very interested in pursuing this more myself.
Yeah. Only the DLL is needed. Yeah. Like once you have a DLL, you could technically delete the scripts and you have your code. The scripts don't matter. The scripts are what gets you to a DLL is effectively the point.
Right.
There is one fun side effect to this that it's slightly different. So now that you've actually seen what IL is, you know what that is, right? We've gone through it. It is that language. You might have heard the term and not really know what it was, called IL2CPP.
Mm-hmm.
It is a concept Unity talks about a lot. Well, let's break it down. IL2CPP. What does CS stand for? C#.
Mm-hmm.
What does CPP stand for?
C++.
What's IL to CPP? Converting IL to
C++.
That's all it is. So that's what IL2CP does. It effectively it's a way to run on certain platforms better, because some platforms don't like IL as much as they like C++.
And so some things aren't supported under that, under projects that get generated or converted to CPP. Yeah.
And what's fun is if you try to decompile a C++ project, it's not as easy as that. You actually can't see the code like that because of the way it doesn't give you a DLL like that. So unfortunately, you actually can't peek at C++ projects in the same way. So if your Unity project is converted to C++, that's probably a better version of obfuscation of your code than anything else you could do. It makes it a lot harder to look at.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think that was good. I think that's a pretty good stopping point. We covered all the things that I'd like to cover, and then some. So appreciate everyone for coming up to the stream. I'm sure there's lots of questions that we missed as we were kind of going through this. So please drop those in the comments, and we'd be happy to get to them. We'll do our best to answer any questions you have. Sometimes we get.
And if you learned anything at all, if you found it at all interesting, please give us an upvote and a comment, and let us know what you thought of it.
Invoke that like button. So thank you guys for coming. I know this is kind of an impromptu stream, but had a lot of fun hanging out with you guys this Sunday afternoon, at least where I'm at. And stay safe. We'll catch you sometime next week for a stream, and if not, Sunday, I'll see you for another video.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, guys. All right, take care.